so much, Samir. Um, I feel that, like most movements, the LGBTQ movement has several contestations, right? Like there are different people, and so there are different aspirations. And there is no single definition of queer. So for me, because I run an initiative called the Queer Muslim Project, the work has been to a great extent, shifting narratives around what constitutes a Muslim individual or a gay person. And, early on when I started that project, I used to face a lot of like trolling online, and there were people telling me that you are using two very explosive identities together. But over the time, I've realized that it really carries meaning, for a lot of people who live with those identities. And I feel that, yes, as a movement, we have certain priorities. We wanted decriminalization, which has thankfully happened. We want several other rights, that should benefit all of us. But I also feel that the movement is incomplete if it tries to only carry one truth or project one narrative as the only kind of standard. So I would be apprehensive of that. Yeah.
Ruth, do you agree that there is no one identity that can be privileged over others in the LGBTQ movement? And I'm asking you this because, just to play the devil's advocate for a minute, if we take away LGBTQ as the central piece, the linchpin, as it were, of the queer movement, and prioritize other identities, as Rafiul was talking about, do we run the risk of defocusing ourselves from the specificity of what we are fighting for?
So I personally believe in the unity, the united people who are oppressed tend to come together and they create great movements together. So I feel like there's a difference between the LGBTQ movement and then there's a difference between the queer movement. So if we're going to talk about this in terms of like queerness also includes all those other identities that are marginalized and that have been in the subalterns for years. So a lot of people are Dalit and queer, a lot of people are tribal and queer. So what we need to do is we need to understand these diversities within the movement and also at the same time try to make the movement more progressive, because I feel like without the unity of all of us, we won't be able to achieve anything. And in order to achieve that unity, we also need to accept and understand and acknowledge that there are subalterns narrative. And we also, I feel like the movement in India, the movement in India in general has been like really elitist, really focused on the older age groups who are more financially independent. And so I feel like the encouragement of the youth to join in is really important. And what do today's youth want? They want diversity. They want most of them have this new wave of wokeness, so to speak. I don't know if people will understand that word, but like a new sense of a responsibility that they have for society. And I think that it's really important that we try to make that flourish.
Davidson, is that also your view? Do you also feel from your praxis? So you run two organizations which focus on the experiences of queer people from the Northeast. Do you also feel that the dominant LGBTQ movement, as it manifests itself in metropolitan cities, sometimes ignores the experiences of the marginalized within the community, that there are internal differentiations within the movement that we have to account for, that we can't always be speaking about a united front, that there are multiple oppressions that we unwittingly sort of further even within the movement?
Um, so, you know, I mean, looking at history itself, looking at the historiography or the discourses on identity as such, not just LGBTIQ. I think identity has always been, a privilege that. Identity has always been a privilege that was, or that has always been in the hands of the few powerful, right? One has to have a certain language, a certain language and idioms, a certain power to even assert a certain position. So, in that sense, identity politics has, for the longest time, been a really tussle of the powerful and the not the powerful ones. So, talking about LGBTIQ movement strictly. I think one of the first tasks. I mean, also we are living in a very interesting time when there are there are multiple narratives even within the LGBTQ IQ narrative itself, and I think we are at a talking in the context of India or Delhi. I think we are at a time when we are grappling with this multiplicity of experiences, identities. So we're surely grappling with that. But coming back to the slideshow that we saw a little while back, the thing that struck me was, there were few slideshows from the Pride March. I'm guessing it. Could be from the Delhi Pride.
All from the Delhi Pride.
All from
Yeah.
Delhi Pride. So this is just a this is a thing that struck me, that how many faces like me or Ruth did we see on the slideshow, for example? And by saying this, I don't mean to convey convey that, oh, Samir didn't do a very good compilation. I don't mean that. What I meant to say is how many Northeastern faces, how many chinky faces, so to say, chinky used as a slur, do we come across in pride marches or the queer spaces in Delhi and other cities? How many, right? And if we agree to the fact that, okay, we don't come across many quite often, then the question is, then why? I mean, the whole question of invisibility. Then, I mean, does it mean that Northeastern people are not queer? They don't have an experience. So I think maybe through the session we'll be able to dig into a little, into that. Why don't we see a lot of Northeastern faces talking about their lives, talking about their experiences? Since we're sitting in Delhi, maybe we can talk about Delhi. Thank you.
Thanks, Davidson, for that perspective. Rafil, I want to bring you in, and I want you to share with the audiences a little bit more about your experiences with the Queer Muslim Project, because I have known how you built that entire organization. There was some resistance that you faced, not simply from conservative religious groups, but also the LGBT movement seeing this as a kind of a move that fragments, as it were, the unity of the movement. That if, for instance, there can be a Muslim group like that, then there can be a Hindu group which can speak about the experiences of queer Hindus. And indeed, there is one in Bombay, and you have received a lot of flack from people within the movement saying that religion should not be brought into what we see as LGBT. So how do you see this experience of navigating these two kind of identities that are often seen as mutually exclusive? How do you seek to bring them together?
So the Queer Muslim Project, it came out of a very personal experience of me being a queer and a Muslim identified man. And I would say that I'm not very religious, but when I started navigating the movement in Delhi, because my first encounter with the movement happened in Delhi, and when I started navigating these spaces, like what Davidson just mentioned, the absence of Muslim experiences, faces, role models, it was very clearly absent, you know, and I felt that even when you go to Muslim spaces, you know, there is this, it's an unsaid pact that you don't talk about your sexuality, you don't talk about pleasure, you don't talk about, this does not exist, right? So, and for a lot of young queer people and queer Muslims that I have been interacting with over the time, this has been like a constant thing that comes out about how suffocated you feel, right? And I think that is what led me to create this initiative. One thing that I want to clarify here is that when you are a religious minority, right? Like when you are a Muslim, you are not only, when you are a Muslim queer person, you're not only dealing with homophobia or transphobia, but also Islamophobia. So I feel that one cannot make a comparison with like some majoritarian religious group, because for us with the Queer Muslim Project, it's not only about being religious or not. In fact, our definition of Muslim itself is very expansive. We say you do not even, you can be an atheist and you could have been born into a Muslim family, but it's very different because there is a social experience that is inherently linked with your identity, right? There is discrimination, there is lack of access. So I think those are also the things that define for us Muslimness in India today. And so of course there have been, like, you know, we've faced brickbats from both sides. I remember we had shared this little poem by a Pakistani queer woman, and in the evening when I had turned, like when logged onto our Facebook, I saw there were around 200 comments that said this person needs to be killed. The admin needs to be killed because this is defaming Islam. But I also know that when we organized like an LGBTQI Muslim retreat earlier this year in January, I know that a lot of people in the like, you know, and I don't want to generalize, but I know that there were people who even said things like, oh, Rafiul is organizing closed door prayers. And I feel that that comes from this deeply inherent, you know, Islamophobia that exists in the society, and somehow queer people are not immune to that kind of hatred. Yeah.
Ruth, how's your experience with Nazaria been? Because, you know, I was going through your Facebook page, and one of the things that the group attempts to do is, in the words of the text that was given on the Facebook page, it said it seeks to challenge all forms of bigotry in society. You know, whether it is homophobia, there is Islamophobia, there is a certain misunderstanding towards the people who come from the Northeast, or, you know, the trans community. In various ways, your group is trying to attempt an intersectional understanding of marginality. Now, my question to you is, how does that translate to praxis? You know, because we understand the theory of intersectionality, which is how all these oppressions sort of come together in unique forms and sort of create internal oppressions, as it were. But what form of praxis does this idea of intersectionality generate? How do you propose to challenge all forms of bigotry at once? It seems to me a Herculean task, almost an impossible dream, you know.
So Nazar, I think the term intersectionality has been overused, but like when I first started Nazaria, I was quite new to it. So the term intersectionality was like, there was like a light bulb above my head, and I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. But I think intersectionality, the word intersectionality has been appropriated now by like people who are majoritarian and people who are in the upper strata of the community. So I don't like to use it that much anymore. I like to just say that it's an inclusive alliance, and that it's a place where the voices of those who have been marginalized are marginalized, doubly marginalized within the queer community, are highlighted more. So basically, intersectionality would mean that everyone is like having a say. But like I think at certain points in queer spaces, like especially like Nazaria, where we try to try to amplify the voices from the sidelines, I think the job of like people who are like the majoritarian or the people who are upper caste, it's their time to like sit back and listen to the people who have been experiencing these prejudices, personal lived experiences. So I think we don't need to speak for the oppressed. We just need to pass the mic. So that's what we do at Nazaria, and I think.
My question was, how does the idea of intersectionality translate into practice?
Yeah, so the idea is we have sort of an affirmative action policy in Nazaria where we get, there's, when you sign in the membership forms, there's this boxes where you can tick whether you're a Muslim, queer, or like a Dalit queer person, OBC, those kind of stuff. So a lot of people think that that is like discriminatory, but I feel like the voices have been silenced for so long that it needs to be at the forefront. It needs to be this at this stage right now. And at this point in the movement, I don't think we need to debate, or we need to like understand how like discriminations are, like how the majoritarian Hindus face discriminations, because like people in the minority and people in the margins, we have been living with these kind of prejudices for like our entire lives. So there's this. In order to understand the queer movement, I think we need to understand the power hierarchy and how it works. And so, for example, in India, like Rafiul said, there's a lot of Islamophobia, there's a lot of racism. Davidson and I were talking about how some profiles would have no Northeasterns, no Chinks, something like that. And I think that's what needs to be questioned, and it needs to be questioned radically.
Davidson, would you like to share some experiences? Because, before we came to the stage, you were talking about the idea of lived experiences being very important to the politics that we practice. What is the importance of lived experiences in your work? And do you think that a certain understanding of the LGBTQ movement has completely sort of ignored that lived experience?
I think it has always been a process of learning and unlearning. Um, I mean, working with the people in the movement, and then having worked with people in the academia, having work with people back in my hometown. I mean, it all has been a learning and unlearning experience. And when I say it, I meant to s- um, say that I think somewhere, uh, there has to be a balance between understanding what is someone's lived experience and that being sort of translated into academic, theory, for example, or having been translated in a certain language, in a certain style. So, but having said that, the balance is important. The Chinky Homo project definitely, puts a lot of emphasis on lived experience, precisely because we believe that the future of the movement has to come from the experience of the people who have been at the end of violence, at the receiving end of violence, harassment, or discrimination. So I think, bearing that in mind, we definitely put a lot of focus on lived experience, and what we do is to try to sort of bring that lived experience on a certain platform. Could be digital media, or in a platform where there's a gathering. Also because the 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 lived experience, some of the lived experience come from certain sphere, uh, um, which is far from the city, in a different language, not in English, in a different language, from a different context. I mean, Northeast again is such a mystified or misunderstood context anyway. So I think it's important to bring the story as it is, without diluting or without refining it, to suit the taste of those who sit in the center. So we let it come out as it is and do its own work, and probably make its presence felt, and create whatever impact it can create.
Thank you. I'm told we have run out of time, so if there are any questions that you have, you can talk to the panelists off stage. Thank you so much for joining us.
It seems like I'm the villain of the piece. But you know what? I'm going to open up the floor because I think some really interesting things came out of this discussion. For instance, I really liked how Ruth said that, I don't think your sexuality has to determine everything that you were born with, right? I really like that, Ruth, and that really struck a chord with me. One question from the audience before we move on to the next session. Anything you'd like to know from our panelists? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Samir to, sort of talk for a couple of more minutes. Yeah?
Actually, I have one question.
Okay.
One burning question that sort of came to the forefront in the wake of Ruth's very controversial placard, which I'm not going to talk about. You may want to look up the net for that. But the question is, and if one, all of you can sort of briefly answer it, there is this great desire, this great, almost great nostalgia that many people have for an apolitical Pride March, right? That Pride Marches should be apolitical. That political issues such as Kashmir, such as caste, such as, what your position on the NRC is, for instance, should not be somehow brought to the Pride March, right? There is this great yearning for this apolitical Pride March. Can this apolitical Pride March come about, Ruth?
Hello. I'm not surprised that the Hindu queer group or whatever was founded in Bombay because it's the most apolitical place in India, and no shade, but the queer movement in India has always been political. I think there are people who are far more experienced than I am in this space right now who know that it has always been political. It first started with the AIDS movement, and then it's always interconnected with other movements. And to just ask for an apolitical pride is a very privileged thing to do, because without our frontrunners, without our the people who have fought for this until this time, they have always been political. And even I feel like right now trans people are not being given the same voice, whereas they have always been at the forefront in the movement. So I think that there's always this interconnectedness of identity and the idea of being LGBTQ or being queer. So to try and separate that from each other would be a travesty of the movement.
I think it would just be reiterating what Ruth shared. For me, pride is political. The very fact that we are out on the streets is a political act, right? Because we are not seen otherwise, like we don't exist. And the very idea of pride is that, you know, that one day this is your space, right? You articulate yourself. And I think the very fact that we come as individuals, we also come with all these baggages that we just discussed. So, and we are not just like, so Rafiul is also Rafiul, right? It is, I am, apart from my queer identity, there are so many other experiences that I live with every day. And if pride is one space where I'll have to censor myself further, then what's the point of pride at all? Yeah.
You know, but do you think that, for instance, should your position on the Ram Mandir be brought to the political, to the Pride March?
I think if it affects your everyday life, if it is, you know, shaping up your public discourse, if it forms, if policy is formed around that question, then definitely you should bring it up. I see no, I think pride should be a space for all kinds of political assertions. I mean, you may disagree, but you know, you cannot censor that space. You cannot say that this is the sanitized, you know, space for you to come and articulate yourself. That cannot happen. Yeah. Thank you.